Madam Chair, we acknowledge on the affirmative side of today's debate that there are some elements of disadvantage that make it hard for particular schools to perform. However, comparatively, some schools that experience the same disadvantage as other schools are constantly failing their students. We don't think that that's good enough. We think that we've seen programs in the United States that exist within disadvantaged communities, like the Knowledge is Power programs in New York and Chicago, like the Achievement Academies in those cities, constantly performing above the level of other programs in the same type of disadvantage. We don't think that it's good enough for a government to say that just because you are disadvantaged in some way, that justifies you failing your students and performing below your average. So the model that we're going to be standing by in today's debate is functionally an implementation across all Western liberal democracies of the Rediscovery Grants program in New York, and I'm going to step through that right now. The first is that we would institute standardised tests based on the National Assessment Education Progress Tests that have bipartisanship support in the United States. What they test is numeracy, literacy, and critical thinking of those students. Once we have seen the results of those standardised tests, we would place schools in comparative brackets, whereby we consider elements of disadvantage like socioeconomic characteristics and like demographic characteristics of those schools. Where certain schools have the majority of students falling below the average of their comparative bracket for 2 consecutive years, we would place them on a publicly available red list. What that red list would do, Madam Speaker, is firstly bring them to the attention of the state and lead that leadership culture in that school to be supervised and provide them with grants to turn that school around. Where they did not turn that school around over a period of 3 years, we would remove all government funding to that school and fundamentally redistribute their students and set up that school again, potentially in the future, with a total overhaul of all of their leadership culture. And that is the plan that we're standing by in this debate. The substantive that I'm going to be bringing to you today is firstly how we know these schools are failing, secondly how we're going to turn them around, and finally why these tests are a legitimate and useful tool. Bronwyn is going to be talking to you about the importance of parental involvement and how we will be exposing elite and middle tier schools that are also failing their students. So firstly, how do we know that these schools are failing? We think that to analyse schools on a comparative basis is the best way to tell whether or not they're failing, because we think that a government has got away for too long to saying that just because you experience some disadvantaged characteristics, that justifies you being below a nationwide average. Yes. What we need to be doing, Madam Speaker, is analysing these groups comparatively in terms of their disadvantage and pointing out where those schools are failing, even though they experience some difficulty. But moreover, we think that the fact that these schools are failing over a period of time, they are continuously failing their students and falling below that average, means that we are correctly identifying the schools that are failing their students. So what does this proposal do in regards to incentivising those schools turning themselves around? How do we improve these schools? The first reason why we think that we improve these schools is that the grant system that's set up in New York, whereby you've got 3 years to turn yourself around, where you've got supervision and those grants, is a redistribution of state funds to schools that need them. We think in the short term, these grants require and energise those schools to do things like invest in IT, to get extra learning support and more staff. We've seen this be effective in the short term, Madam Speaker, because one of the most effective policies we've seen disadvantaged schools take up is the extension of school hours and the extension of the school week and years. What we think that requires in the short term, Madam Speaker, to turn these schools around is the additional resources to fund that learning staff in order to enact those short term policies. So number one, we think those grants will enable that school to turn around its systemic failure. Number two, we think that the supervision of the state means that they will turn themselves around. We think that this will allow those schools to have publicly available access to policy experts within the government, and that the government is going to be keeping a hawkish eye over those schools, Madam Speaker, so they will get the type of advice that they need. But secondly, it motivates the leadership culture within that school to actually energise themselves and stop simply non-innovating and keeping up to date with the comparative educational standards. because we acknowledge that that leadership culture is going to be humiliated by being put on a red list, but to the extent they've been failing their students, they certainly deserve for that to happen, Madam Speaker. Thirdly, we think that this incentive goes wider than just the grants and the supervision. Those teachers know that if they don't turn around the results of their students, they're going to lose their job at that school. And we think that that is important for those teachers to actually put more effort into their job and turn those results around. But secondly, we think that the type of parental pressure on the school and the public pressure on the state that results from this public red listing means that they're going to have that incentive to perform, and that's something that Bronwyn is going to be talking about later as well. So we think that all of these improvements and this incentivisation of improvements in standards means that student drift from these schools is not going to be substantive, Madam Speaker. Firstly, we would say that empirically, where this has been enacted in Arizona, Texas, Chicago and the United Kingdom, that student drift hasn't been substantial. But at a more analytical level, Madam Speaker, we think that first of all, if we are able to improve the educational standards of a few students, even just a few students in those schools, we believe that that lifts the entire school's standard, because we acknowledge that the education and the encouragement and enthusiasm of a few students rubs off on the rest of their class. Thirdly, we think that we've seen communities rallying when their schools are placed upon these red lists, and through the exact type of advocacy mechanisms that Bronwyn's going to talk to you about. But finally, we think that to the extent that there is student drift, these students will get a better education going to other schools, but moreover, that schools that can meet the demand are going to be the ones that take them on. So let's look finally at this third idea of why these tests are a legitimate thing to base this on. Firstly, we would say standardised tests do not provide a complete picture of education. We agree with that. But what we're going to prove to you is that they are incentivise improvement on the parts of education that most matter, Madam Speaker. That is numeracy and literacy. There are three reasons why they matter the most. The first is that literacy and numeracy are the key to all other educational aspects. If you have a reading level that is lower than your comparative average, we think that hampers your education in other areas like social sciences. Literacy and numeracy are the basis of all other educational pursuits. Secondly, standardised testing, this type of standardised testing, is the precise avenue whereby you get jobs and university degrees. This is what people are looking for, Madam Speaker, and interestingly, literacy and numeracy are the biggest gap between different socio-economic groups. So we think this is what we need to target in order to bridge that gap. And finally, we think that literacy and numeracy are the prerequisites for performing as an active citizen within society, because you need to be able to do things like read the newspaper in order to be an active citizen, but also to know your rights, Madam Speaker, in society, and also to be able to manage your own finances. We think that to the extent that this proposal leads to teachers focusing on literacy and numeracy, we're happy for that to happen because they are the key building blocks to all education. Madam Speaker, too long of disadvantaged schools got away with pointing to the fact that they are disadvantaged but comparatively failing their students. We would remove the funding from those schools that have systemically failed those students.
I'd like to thank Elle for her speech, and I welcome the first speaker of the negative team, Nihar.
The stance coming from negative is that education is a universal birthright of everybody, and it doesn't matter if you are not as smart, it doesn't matter if you're disadvantaged because you're poor. We think that it's a universal obligation of these governments in these countries to prioritize them regardless of whether they have enough money. So we don't think it's good enough for you to say that there are limited resources, so we need to prioritize them better. We think everybody has equal priority and equal value when it comes to the state. So that's going to be the stance we're going to talk about. But let's look at some of the material we've heard heard from government so far. Like, the first thing I want to talk about is their entire policy. Like, we're absolutely okay with monitoring schools, we're absolutely okay with supervising them, and yeah, of course, ladies and gentlemen, if a school isn't doing very well, we should help them out. So we're absolutely okay with giving them grants, giving them, government supervision and all of that stuff. So like, a lot of the stuff she said for the first like 2 to 3 minutes, we're all okay with that. We're all okay with, investing in knowledge is power, investing in IT, investing in all those awesome things. What we're not okay with is the removal of funding that comes after that 3 years. So we think that all of the other apparatuses that work for state intervention and state uplifting of schools continue to exist in our paradigm, but we think that when push comes to shove, we still won't say that you don't deserve funding. So let's look at that, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, we think that if the school has failed for 3 years, we think that that's not an adequate time period for us to evaluate that the school is an absolute failure. Because what's really going to happen in that time period is that the good students are going to leave that school, so you really have a school left with academically weak students, and that's probably why for 3 years they continue to struggle to figure out a way to teach these kids how to learn. Like, some kids just learn differently from other kids, so it's not good enough for you to say that, look, if after 3 years you still can't figure it out, we're going to cut your funding off. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we think that their simple solution, let's just put more pressure on teachers, isn't the right solution at all. Because what it then instills in teachers is that when there is this ticking bomb of 3 years, I'm just going to start cheating on my test like a little bit earlier than I would have, 2 years ago. So when we introduce this notion of a ticking bomb, that your salary is dependent on this test that this child who is not in your control is going to take, it's not going to motivate good morale, it's not going to motivate an incentive to teach better, it's really just going to motivate teachers to circle and shade the bubbles for their students, as we have seen happen in a lot of states in America. So we don't think that their analysis on, hey, if we pressurize teachers, that will always be good, that doesn't really stand, and we don't think we heard any proof of it besides them just saying it 3 times. Then let's talk about whether or not humiliating the leadership culture really is going to do anything about it. But like, first of all, we're okay with humiliation if you want to do that. We're okay with putting you on the red list and making you aware that there are shortcomings that you need to answer to. So we're okay with parents putting pressure and saying that, look, you need to be more accountable to me as a parent. But we're not okay with the removal of funding. Because what is funding, ladies and gentlemen? We think it is pivotal to the functioning of any school. Because if you remove funding, it means obviously, like they can see that the school basically gets shut down, right? You can't get high quality teachers, you can't really motivate these teachers really well, the classroom size goes up, you can't get a good student-teacher ratio, you can't get the kind of facilities you need. So like, funding is obviously crucial to these schools, and we think that that is where the real crunch is, that's where the pressure becomes too much, and that's why it motivates the wrong kind of action. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, are these tests legitimate? Yeah, sure, they are. Sure, it's good, that we learn literacy and numeracy, but we do contest that there are other things in life that are more important, and I'm going to talk to you about that in my substantive. But more than that, we're perfectly fine for people to use the SATs to get into college, and we think that that's why standardized tests continue to have the reputation that they have. We don't need to link it to funding to over-prioritize it in the education system. It's already a priority for everybody because they need that to get into college. Why do we need to over-prioritize it? And we think that that's basically the problem that government needs to defend. So let's talk about the substantive. I'm going to tell you in my speech. I'm going to tell you that the principle of state funding lies to the universal provision of high-quality education. And we guarantee that high-quality education when we give you all of the state support when it comes in things like the grants and all these nice programs, but especially also when it comes to that funding that is unconditional, that boosts that morale, that you're going to be able to cope with these problems. So let's talk about this principle of state funding. We don't think that first of all, like to propose that education is a universal right. It's basically a birthright, and it's especially something that the government has created a legitimate expectation for everyone to get. The fact that education at the primary and even high school level is mandatory introduces the notion that citizens and kids everywhere expect the provision of that high quality education, or even if it's not high quality, of any sort of education. We think that the solution of let's just shut some schools down and shuttle these kids around is not really a good solution at all, because it means that those kids are denied an access to an education close to home. They're denied an access to an education in a school where they've already been studying, where potentially things could have been working for them, but the ticking time bomb just didn't give them enough time. So we think that first of all, there is a legitimate expectation of these kids to get that kind of education, but more importantly, we reject this utilitarian calculus that if you're not worth it, we're just not going to give you the money, that if you don't prove your worth to the state, you don't deserve that funding. We think that stupid kids, to put it like, not very nicely, we think that stupid kids deserve the same amount of funding as perhaps, smarter kids. We don't think that the state should be the apparatus that discriminates based on your intrinsic ability and your intrinsic values. Like if you just can't do math very well, as a lot of us can't do, that doesn't mean the state says that I'm going to deny your school funding because you couldn't perform in these average tests. So we think that this necessarily compromises the quality of education that kids have access to, and we don't think that the state should perpetuate the vicious cycle that comes out of this, because the reason why you're not doing well in standardized tests is perhaps because you're not very smart, and that just gets perpetuated when the state puts immense pressure on your teachers and your schools to try and fix you, and then they just take shortcuts. So that's my second substantive, that this compromises learning, because what it does is creates a very strong, because it's funding, perverse incentive to do all of the shortcut techniques that really get the job done. We think that this is a very prevalent problem, and we have a couple of layers. We see teachers who are teaching to the test, where they deprioritize things like experiential learning, teaching of other life skills, just like moral lessons, because instead it's more important that I teach to the test, it's more important that I make sure that even if you don't have good moral values or you don't have any civic duty, you can do math, ladies and gentlemen. While we think that that's a good skill to have, we don't think it's necessarily absolutely important, and we think that the state doesn't place a utilitarian judgment. If you're a handicapped person, your life is just as valuable, even if you may not be as able-bodied as an able-bodied person. So we think that it's important that teachers don't teach to the test. And we quote to you the Newsweek study where they interviewed people who were in the 20th, the top 20th percentile of these standardized tests, and 97% of them could not tell you who the Secretary of State of America was, and 82% of them couldn't tell you what the capital of Australia was. And if you've seen that YouTube video of stupid Americans, you know that there is a severe lack of real learning, that there is rote learning that is adopted by schools because that's the shortcut that the state encourages through funding. We think that the teaching by teachers that we saw in the Chicago School Board study that is across the board is another dangerous problem. And this is very bad because the people that we need to keep honest, the people that we need to keep motivated and have good morale are the people who have this perverse incentive to take shortcuts because their paychecks rely on that. So we think this is absolutely the wrong solution for schools.
I'd like to thank Neha for her speech. Now welcome the second affirmative, Bronwyn.
Madam Speaker, this side of the House told you that all children have a right to an education. Absolutely. Which is why we need to change the status quo, where children in Year 9 in inner city schools across the developed world graduate or drop out at Year 9 without being able to read at a grade level that extends beyond the 3rd grade, Madam Chair. That right is not being implemented by governments in the status quo. That right is being systematically undermined by a developed world educational system that is failing the most disadvantaged, that is failing the poorest, and that is failing those communities that most desperately need their citizens to be better educated. So, I'm first of all going to engage in a defence of our model. I'm going to be talking about why we think these tests are perfectly legitimate mechanisms of studying achievement, and finally this question of a right to education. My substantive material will be about fostering parental involvement and about how that is oftentimes the best mechanism of improving educational attainment. And finally I'm going to be talking about exposing those schools that kind of like to pretend they're really good but probably aren't. So, the model. This side of the house said we're fine with grants, we're fine with supervision, and we're fine with looking after these schools. First thing we'd say to that, yes, but you're doing that without any kind of incentive or any kind of stakes, really, on the line, Madam Chair. This side of the house in her 6th minute conceded that our model was, quote, a strong incentive to change how you operate your school, to try and discover what it was about your learning mechanisms that was failing these children. They want to continue an expensive status quo that has failed these children systematically, Madam Chair. They said it's different to funding. We're perfectly happy to continue funding. The United States spends mind-boggling amounts of money on urban education. Truly, truly staggering. Yet the rates of educational attainment of urban and indeed far rural schools in America has fallen under the status quo that this side of the house is advocating for. Money tied to no kind of incentive, money tied to no standard of achievement or expectation of your children being able to read and add is a recipe for an expensive system that fails students, Madam Chair. This side of the house said good students will lead. We think there are several instances, including Arizona, California and New York, where that kind of good student flight has not been as marked as this side of the house would have you believe. Moreover, we said there was a contradiction when they accepted the majority of our model, including publicly red listing these schools, and then said the problem of our side of the house was that they would leave. If they accept what their first speaker said, they're going to have to accept that disadvantage as well, despite the fact that we don't actually think it's going to happen particularly much. This side of the house then said teachers will cheat. Almost every developed country in the world institutes some kind of government-mandated test whereby they test the ability of students and then take the results to an external testing centre and mark it or put it through a computer. To say that teachers will cheat, we think is probably a little bit perverse. We think that teachers are interested in the educational attainment of the children that they teach. And moreover, the fact that most of these testing schemes are pretty good and pretty accurate, including No Child Left Behind and the NEAP, which we established in our model is what we'll be using, suggests to us that teachers aren't going to cheat. So, what would the outcome of shutdown be under our model? We accepted that these schools would probably close. That's fine. That's happened under the development model that Elle mentioned in New York City, and it's raised levels of educational attainment for these students. We think that the money that you save lavishly funding a failing school can be redirected to other schools. And they said they have to travel to another school far away. No, in urban centres, which are where this debate really happens, there is usually a glut of schools in the area. Like in Manhattan, there's a school every 2 city blocks, yeah? Unfortunately, school A is doing really well, and 2 city blocks away, school B is failing. We think we can redirect that funding, close the school that is failing and has an endemic culture of lack of achievement, and send the students to a nearby school that is doing well. We think that is what has happened. I'm going to defend now the idea of teaching to the test, because that is a phrase invented by public teachers' unions in the United States to avoid accountability. Madam Chair, we are perfectly happy for you to teach to the test when that test teaches you skills that are fundamental. You cannot understand your civic duty, as this side of the house wanted you to, when you don't understand what the word civic means, Madam Chair, which I think is probably a realistic expectation of the kind of kids that we're talking about, who cannot write, Madam Chair. That is the depth of their disadvantage and their lack of attainment. So we think that the NEAP, which is indeed superior to the NCLB, No Child Left Behind test, insofar as what it actually measures, is superior. All of the higher order thinking and more like abstract thinking that they want to talk about, like art and drama and like understanding your civic duty, becomes vastly more difficult when you cannot read and you cannot balance your checkbook, Madam Chair. So yes, absolutely teach to that test. We're happy for the tests to become progressively harder as the children like get older, you know, like advanced testing, yeah? Okay, we also said that we're going to test critical thinking, which is not something you can just teach to the test for. They happily ignored that part of our model, because critical thinking, we think, is a really good way of plucking those children from disadvantaged backgrounds who just happen to be a little bit canny, because it isn't something you can necessarily teach to the test for, even though we're happy for that to happen when it comes to really vital things. They then said use the SATs, etc. These are not children who are taking the SATs. They're not children who are taking the Oxbridge exams. They're stuck in local comprehensives and they probably drop out at year 10. We need to measure that progress as they go through. You need to make sure that progress happens in primary and middle school, so by the time they take those SATs, they're not fallen as far behind, because it is impossible to correct educational disadvantage when you're 17. It's much easier to do it when you're 18. Sorry, when you're like 12. Parental involvement. Elle mentioned this and I'm going to extend on that now. Parents don't know oftentimes the full picture of their school's situation. They often live in only one neighbourhood or connect with the parents of that same school. They oftentimes only have that school's representatives, like its teachers and its principals, to talk to about the educational experience of their students. They're oftentimes themselves disadvantaged, didn't go to university, have to work long hours to support their families, and they don't have mechanisms of finding out what the wider educational picture for their children is. When you give them access to comparative data, which elucidates the actual educational attainment of that school, and importantly, in comparison to them, tells you that there will be stakes based on that particular educational attainment, that there will be outcomes based on that educational attainment, we think they're vastly more likely to become engaged with their school. That has happened in some of the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods of New York, where parents were previously almost unaware that their children were attending school. Madam Chair, why is that important? One of the most significant indicators of a child's educational attainment, beyond like whether their school is actually teaching them properly, is not whether their parent had a university degree, not whether their parent reads to them at night, but whether their parent forces that school to do its job, whether that parent attends parent-teacher interviews, whether that parent goes to the teacher and discusses the performance of the class, whether that parent connects with other parents and kind of gang up on the principal together. When your school is like, I don't know, quite literally red-listed, like we put it in red ink, sure. When that is the case, you are vastly more likely, and moreover, you're more equipped to do it. Because the government is giving you the information that teachers, unions, and that state educational boards routinely keep secret from you, Madam Chair. Under their model, they still wanted the red listing, so all of the disadvantages that they thought flowed from it will exist under their model, or their counter model, yeah? But they don't have stakes. They don't have outcomes, and they don't have things that rely on you improving the educational attainment of your students. Any number of people agree with us on this issue, Madam Chair. The head of the NAACP, Milton Friedman, Diane Ravitch, who's one of the biggest, but those guys don't really agree, right? Diane Ravitch, who's one of the most well-respected educational experts in the United States. This side of the House is advocating a system which is failing. Joe Klein, the New York State Education Secretary, said not one more day. We agree. Not one more child will we permit to fail in a system that lavishly funds despite it.
I'd like to thank Bronwyn for her speech. Now welcome the second negative, Li Fang.
The problem with ads today is that they tell us all these truistic things about education, like more money makes you better, tests are objective, and that people who can read and write are just a good thing. But the problem is that they never analyze the effects of their model, the penalizing that happens, and how this results in greater harms, and I'll do that, in my speech. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about has to do with the model. So now they came back to tell us that we already pointed out that incentives do exist in the status quo, things like grants, like recognition, giving out teachers awards, and increasing the pay of teachers already happens in the status quo. Those are incentive enough. They said there weren't the same incentives in ours, so let me look at the incentive in theirs. We say that incentive is a perverse incentive because it's a negative incentive. It is a, if you don't do this job, I will revoke your pay. I will revoke your funding. That's not the sort of incentive that we want to encourage in an educational system. But I shouldn't be teaching because I am held hostage to my pay, because I am being harassed, and at any time the state is going to shut down our school. We don't think that's a good environment for learning. We don't think that's what we want to encourage. The next thing that we have to say under
incentives is that he said is that it's an unhomogeneous, or it is homogeneous, it doesn't recognize the nuances of different schools and the challenges that they face. Now let's face it, we're talking about the bell curve that all of us suffer under in like our university system. There will always be people at the bottom end and at the top end as well. We think there's this continuous pressure for you to get yourself out of that little end of the bell curve. When the bell curve just exists because that's like natural distribution, because there are many factors that are perhaps different for people under different regions of the bell curve, and there are many conditions that are out of your hand. So the next thing that we come back to them is I challenge them to analyze more, although it's in their third speech, on their model. Essentially their model is predicated on, it worked in New York, so this New York scheme can be replicated everywhere else in the United States of America, because everywhere else in the United States of America is the same. We reject that. We think it shows no analysis as to how like there are just different cultures, different learning cultures, different like economic like distribution. Like you can't just say that social and economically people who earn a GDP of 1,000 per capita is the same in Maryland, in New York, on the West Coast and the East Coast. There's so many other factors that they didn't come back to us on. The next thing that we also said is what Neha said the effects of their policy are. When you like shut down schools and give funding to like a school that does better, we say what happens is not a redistribution or the replication of like good teaching models, it's a redistribution of like stupid kids. So how do you raise, what's the easiest way to raise your average? The easiest way is not to accept people who have lower IQs, it is to have a few people with low IQs amongst a lot of people who fit into the nice average of the bell curve. So you are distributing all these students, and we say that results in hiding the problem, because we say that these like well not intellectually, but like these kids who don't do well on tests, they need certain environments. They can't be always at the end of the bell curve. They'll be forever stuck there, because then they're competing against everyone else whom they weren't meant to compete against. Then let me go on to the point on fundamental skills. Their logic is this. It's just good for people to read and good for people to write. Therefore, their policy works. We reject that. That's not enough analysis, because first of all, it's true. The first thing I have to say is, what do you think teachers are teaching in our schools today? Obviously, they're teaching people to read and to write. So we don't think it's an issue of like not being able to balance my check, or like not being able to read like McDonald's fast food, like the items that I can order there. So what we say is that either you set the standard so low that it's just about like counting money and reading like the menu on McDonald's, or you set it so high. And when you set it so high, when it comes about like algebra and like calculus and like reading like logarithms and stuff like that, then you discriminate against ability. It does become about kids who can get algebra just better because it's innate, and a kid who is like just good at music doesn't get that sort of recognition. You do discriminate against ability. That may have substantive the principle of equality, that whatever your talent, you deserve equal opportunities in life. And the final thing, was their 2 minutes substantive on parental involvement. So they said that, like parents aren't involved because like a lot of times they're like too busy working, they're not literate, they just don't care, they don't even know their kids are in school. How does that change when you have a red list? It doesn't change. There are no incentives, because if I don't care my child's in school, I don't care that his school is shut down. That's the first thing. The next thing that we say is that you can already have access to such information, but not against publishing of these information. The problem is when you penalize schools and you cut off funding. We think it's even worse in the long run, because now we think that there isn't that sort of like long-term relationship that like a parent can build. We think you're penalizing parents in terms of school funding when this isn't an issue that is their fault. So let me move on to my substantive on the negative side. The first thing that I want to talk to you is about the teaching profession and the poor morale. We think that morale in the teaching profession is already low. Like teachers just tired, they're tired of talking. They just face so many challenges, in schools. We think that many teachers come into the profession not so that I can compete against other schools in the bell curve and get a higher salary. We think they come in wanting to make a genuine difference. They recognize the educational challenges. They recognize that teaching isn't about the money per se, because then you might as well be a banker, I suppose, or like you don't go into teaching for those reasons. You go into teaching to cultivate, to bring up people, because you have a good desire to teach. We think this introduces a sort of perverse incentive, because now I don't teach like for the love of teaching, because now like I have all these challenges which are not recognized by the state, and they are going to revoke these. We also think this is bad on the second level, because it doesn't give the adequate recognition to teachers with like special skills. Like we think like education isn't homogenous. Like, you know, it's not enough to just like teach math and English and I've got my job done. Like you need to engage students. You need to like engage them in co-curricular activities. There's like character building. And obvious, we're not saying that these are things that are not assessed or that these are endpoints in and of themselves. But oftentimes in the communities, the poor communities that we're talking about, these are tools which are necessary to even get them like interested in education, to even get them to come in. So this is the sort of overhauling that we're talking about. It's not just teach math and teach English better. We need to get the kids into the classroom. We need to want them to believe that they have a future in education. These are the things that result in systematic change and actually uplifting our standards. The policy doesn't do that at all. We also see on the third tier that's about things like, you know, special programs that teachers, that how it's not just like that one teacher alone or that one administrator, it's the whole system. Like a teacher kid in grade 1, I have to pass him on to like grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6. We think that your system says that at grade 6, when these people do badly, like it's the grade 6 teachers' fault. It doesn't recognize how education is a whole fabric, it's a whole network. Like you just can't assess it because of, you know, the things that they talk about. And so at the end of the day, we think we are clear. It's not enough to just say you teach math and you teach English and these are sufficient outcomes. We don't think they came back to us on the principle of equality. If you set your standards too high, which is what they want, then you're going to discriminate people against their innate ability and innate talents. We don't think we stand for that in an egalitarian society. We don't think that's what education is about, and hence we're proud to oppose.
I would thank Lee Feng for his speech. Now welcome the third affirmative, Daniel Swain.
Madam Speaker, our opposition told us that they just wanted to carry on writing out blank cheques to the worst schools and the worst performing schools and hope they would succeed. So here's how the red list would work in their model. Every year the principal would open the envelope and it's, "My dear, you've been red listed again." She'll be like, "Egads, more money." Like, how is that really going to incentivise change? When the next year she fails again, opens up the envelope, she's like, "Not another cheque, please." We ultimately think that the way you change about the behaviours is not just by carry on giving money to the schools you recognise and concede continue to fail their students. And it was principally inconsistent for them to say they would adopt all of those mechanisms, like publishing which schools are failing, and then saying that we're the only team in this debate that's affecting teacher or student morale. Because if they were going to shame them, they may as well follow through on their promise and actually develop these schools. I have two questions. The first one is there a problem with closing down schools? And the second one is there a serious problem with testing students in the way that they've chosen? So the first way about closing down schools. And the principle they opted at the beginning of their speech was that we could not prioritise students' needs, we could not withhold money. That is a stupid kind of egalitarianism, Madam Speaker. A more functional kind of egalitarian student system is to say that we recognise the right of all students to learn equally, and that therefore because some students are disproportionately disadvantaged or disproportionately being failed, we should elevate them up to a position of equality, not treat them like a blind state that is not recognising the special needs of certain communities. That's not crazy, as the first speaker told us. It's just budgeting. States have to rely on outcomes with finite budgets. And for a team that was saying they were willing to hand out extra money to some schools, it was perverse of them to say that that's necessarily withholding money from other schools. So they were a philosophically inconsistent case to begin with. But even if that weren't the case, we recognise that it's the right of the state in a publicly funded system to measure outcomes and award performance-based bonuses on that, and also make sure that the investment that taxpayers pay is actually delivering serious outcomes. And yes, we recognise that everyone has a right to education. That's the precise principle behind Elle's first argument, which was to say that because each student has a right, that's why we should intervene in this instance, and not just give more money to schools that are already succeeding. We said that was absolutely perverse. The second thing they said is that we don't value students under our system. The very structure of our model reminds students of their intrinsic value, reminds them of their intrinsic rights, and reminds the state of its obligation to those students. But further than that, it shows them that other students in the same circumstance can succeed. Because the very nature of this model is you pointed out that relatively they are not succeeding, that they could be doing better, that their poverty is not a prison. In that sense, we empower these students and their communities. They said you'll never reach communities because they said these people are just too poor, they're all drunk, they don't care where their students are. First of all, we think that's frankly offensive to say that's true of all poor families. But insofar as families aren't energised, what giving more money to schools do to motivate parents? Parents will be like, the government's solving it, not my problem. The government's going to give my students cash. I'll just sit here in the status quo. Under our system, we force parents to rally to keep that school open, should they want to keep it open. Under our system, we give parents a real incentive to get involved. But the other thing about our incentive is it's very simple. If people aren't familiar with the culture of schooling and educational policy, we send them a really simple and direct message. 2 years, 24 months will close your school down. That's what gets across to parents that come from communities that don't value education. We said that was something that's fundamentally on our side of the debate. What they then said is that we can't shame teachers, we can't shame parents. I've got a number of responses to this. Number one is they've previously flagged they're already doing it under their system because they agreed to do things like pay teachers more if there were better teachers and shame schools on public blitz, so it's philosophically inconsistent to say that they weren't doing it as well. But even if that were not the case, even if they weren't having a structurally fucked up case, even if that weren't true, we still have a number of responses we can offer here. The first one is that teachers are employees and we value their conception of their profession. We think it's really important that they live out the good life, but ultimately the state is paying a check. And if teachers love teaching as they said they do, then they shouldn't love failing students. And the very teachers we've identified are the ones responsible for that. They said there is a network, a fabric of education. Yes, it's a very expensive one. Only one person in the fabric between community, parents, teachers and students is getting paid, and it's the teachers. And therefore they have a greater moral responsibility for that care of education. But let's not pretend as well that because education is multifaceted, there isn't one direct driver. There isn't one person that stands at the front every day and provides that information to students, whose professional and personal responsibility it is to raise educational standards. We think it's fair to blame that teacher. We're not blaming her or he entirely. We're blaming the school structure. They're the person the most directly targeted. We say it's a failure of educational leadership. And your responsibility as a principal is to encourage that whole network. So even if it's the fault of parents or the community, that is still the responsibility of the principal to interact with that structure and resolve those problems. We think it's legitimate to punish that principal for failing to do that within this particular debate. They said, no, it's fine, guys, because they still care about the SATs because they're getting into college. We gave you Ron told you about it, was just like a UMC, upper middle class perspective on this debate. Because ultimately these kids were never going to get to college. In fact, we recognise that kids at the schools we're talking about may still drop out early, which is why it's important they have good test scores to point to employers, because they never got round to sitting the SATs. We say that's the direct value of our model. We think that teachers don't care about it enough, and all they're up under their system, they get money if they fail or money if they succeed, but money happens anyway. We say that what you need to do actually incentivise change. They said, how do you know this is only going to work in New York? This only works in New York. We told you it worked in Arizona, in Texas, in the United Kingdom. But even if that weren't true, the very structure of our model means that all kinds of demographic factors can be taken into account. If one community struggles particularly from the fact of being rural, they factor that into their modelling, their formula by which they measure against schools. We think jurisdictions can mould this to the ones that suit them the best. So in Australia, for example, rural education is a significant problem. We think they can deal with that within the system by moulding it to their particular group. Let's move to the second question about testing. The first one was a stupid response here, was like corruption. We're not told you why one kind of corruption can't occur because it's a supervised test, because the test is marked externally. But also, like, if the response is that you think that teachers are so bad, so morally corrupt and bankrupt, they've like circled the wrong bubbles, then get the test supervised, do them in the school hall, get someone external to watch them completing these tests. We know that's an insurmountable problem of our model. But furthermore, if you're saying that the reason that we should protect the teacher profession with accountability is because it's too corrupt, we know that's a seriously challenging principle for you to stand behind in this debate. The next thing they said is it's a bell curve, and that's fundamentally problematic. First of all, who said we're marking this on a bell curve? Because it was norms referenced. It was like, are you able to read at someone who is your age level? We know that's perfectly acceptable. But even if it was, why is people at the lowest point of the bell curve constantly being concentrated in that particular area or constantly slipping? They said you either set the standards too high or you set the standards too low. Either way your model fails. They missed the point of our model. We didn't set the standards, your fellow students did. Students who were like you set the standard against you by the very nature of being like you. And that standard shifted up and down depending on how well that society was doing to educate its children. But ultimately we said, well, where that line could be drawn to similar students, you should not fall below it. And where you do, the state has failed. They said some students are disabled. Like we weren't going to factor that in, guys. But we think that's something we can build into our model as well. Then they said you're only going to teach the test. I have many responses to this. The first thing is to say that having behavioural and moral education is linked to performance in tests. If your school is constantly suffering from disciplinary problems, you can't successfully educate those children. Indeed, some schools that have got these rediscovery grants in the US have bought things like security guards. If they think that's their best investment, that's the thing they need to do to bring up moral education. The second thing is, as we told you in Ron speak, critical thinking is vital to unlocking all kinds of education. It can't be taught for the test. So we think that ultimately what they're doing here is having to energise students and educate them in different ways. The third thing we said is parental involvement and supervision. The element of time model that you would never get under a system with no incentive. Ultimately mean they're not going to be able to teach you a test. Because parents are going to walk into these schools and see them doing that teaching of the test. Our supervisors are going to walk into the school and see them doing that teaching of the test. When you get the educational establishment involved in the schools that need it most, they can point out we can improve things like sports and music. The fourth thing is we say is that all things being equal in schools is like a generous lie. Like it's true that it's great if kids can dance and sing and act. We can still reward those achievements without saying that the core things of education required to activate those things and engage with them can also be recognised. We think that ultimately that's the reason why we're going to succeed in schools. But in terms of the drift from these schools, all those reasons we not respond to about why this drift was minimal, but where it did occur, it would go to schools that we would force to accept them. Like you can't deny students access to your school. We force them to accept them, and therefore we send schools to the schools that can manage these kids the most and are specialised at managing disadvantaged children. Because that was the case, we weren't going to damage students' resistance. We would improve their education and recognise the right of first neighbours to violate this debate, the right of every child to successful education.
I'd like to thank Daniel for his speech, and I welcome the third negative, Regine.
Ladies and gentlemen, after 5 years when you don't see any results, is it then the problem of the school, or is it the problem of the innate ability of the students that you now prematurely judge and say they can never rise out of that? That's the question, ladies and gentlemen, because the time frames they set up at the start was something that prematurely recognized talent and recognized that this person will never go further than that. The consequences after that is all we talked about, for example, disadvantaged learning and all that sorts of things. That's what we need to look at. For example, what exactly are the three things in this debate? Firstly, I'm going to talk about whether these tests are actually a good reflection of ability in society. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the role of the state and whether this is in line with the principles of what state allocations of budgets are. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about the effects of parents and students and all that sorts of things. But let's clarify first thing first. That we are willing to say, we're willing to sacrifice some of the smartest that we have, who would have potentially furthered their talent even more, because we want a large group of people not to be left out in the system. And that's a trade-off we are willing to make right from the onset. So let's go to the first question. Whether the tests are really a good reflection of ability in life. Because what did they say from F? They said, look, it's good because it's the basic things in life. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, all these are a good measurement, because other than that, you can learn other things like arts and music and all that sorts of things. We say, firstly, those things are already being taught when you teach normal curriculum anyway. Literacy, things like critical thinking are already present in the curriculum to begin with. It's not something you need to devote over attention on, because that's what the result of the policy is. That all things about literacy, all things about math, and all that sorts of things that are only present in tests becomes over-prioritized. That's the nuance we drew, ladies and gentlemen. It's not that these tests just focus on these things. We think they just do too much. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, the second response we have is this. That if you do focus too much, then what it leads to is simply just drilling. It's about repetition. It's about what x plus y will be equals. And that's the problem, ladies and gentlemen, because all the other things in life, or all the other things in education, becomes deprioritized. All that came up right from the onset of this debate, but we had no response to that. We acknowledge, ladies and gentlemen, that it's necessary to do well in life. The question then is whether that test, which we already believe is good anyway, should be used as a stakeholder to remove funding. That's the question of this debate. This debate isn't just about whether tests are good per se. It's about what's the costs that are incurred at the end. But what else did they then say? They say, look, teachers within schools would be incentivized to teach better, because what if the principal just keeps getting a blank check all day long? Well, yes, ladies and gentlemen, we think the first response we have against that is that teachers will cheat. This was something we told you right from the onset, because it creates a very perverse incentive for them not to lose their jobs, to use all means to retain their profession. And what's the difference we drew? It's not like bonuses, ladies and gentlemen, because that's what they say. Look, what's wrong with incentivizing? Yes, because that's an upward scale, because you know at least your minimum income is still protected. That's why teachers won't be pushed over the edge to forge results, as opposed to when they lose their entire livelihood, ladies and gentlemen, which is why the perverse incentive is stronger under our paradigm. When states like Maryland and Baltimore, teachers often cheat. They say, look, well, you can just take it to an external center anyway, it doesn't concern them. No, that's not the point. Of course, the external markers are going to be neutral. It's about when the test sheets reach them, they've already been filled in by the teachers anyway. So we think that the cheating, the kind of perverse incentives to forge results, is an insidious thing they can't remove. And never did they respond to this. More importantly, ladies and gentlemen, what else did we tell you in the second response? We told you this, that yes, perhaps, some students aren't good, and it's the problem of the structure. We need to understand that after time, the structure doesn't play a part in a student's failing anymore. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, we talk to you about innate ability. Because even if you concede that perhaps the school isn't as good as it was, we think that some education, which is inferior, is still better than no education at all when the school is forced to then shut down. Why? Because for children, for students, when you tell them they can't succeed in life, that's when they don't succeed in life. When you drew the mentality that you're always hopeless, that's when they're disincentivized to learn even more. That's why it's a self-fulfilling cycle. If the school gets less and less funding because they have less facilities, they have less student-teacher ratio, that's when they'll do worse in the next year, or the third year, or the fifth year, and then you cut their funding, and that's why they do even worse anyway. That's why it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, ladies and gentlemen, because you don't address the fact that sometimes structures in schools only do that much to lift students out of their inability to deal with tests, but it doesn't deal with the rest of their inability, which can't be circumvented, like just plain intellect. But what else did we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that wasn't responded? We told you, ladies and gentlemen, that teachers who don't are incentivized to teach even more. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because now, especially when you're teaching the people who aren't as intellectually able, you create a circumstance which is unfavorable for teaching to happen in the first place. All that, ladies and gentlemen, went unresponded. That's what we say, ladies and gentlemen, on just the balance of probabilities. Even if we concede that the structure isn't that good, we think that that structure is unnecessary for the rest of the children who are still a minority, who still can't compete with the national standards. But let's talk about the second issue, the role of the state. Because what did they say? They said, look, you're funding a failing system, and that's why it's not good for a state budget. It's about allocative efficiency, and this is not what the role of the state is. But the thing is, the state never values just people based on their innate ability alone, because some things can't be changed. But what the state does do is to recognize that we don't close opportunities to you to level up from your innate disability that perhaps other people can't have anyway. That's why we told you, ladies and gentlemen, that we don't place utilitarian calculus. Their model is one that prioritizes the smarter ones, the more intellectually able ones, but neglects those at the bottom. That's why we don't use utilitarian calculus. All that we told you, ladies and gentlemen, that perhaps your ability is a value in and of itself that we treasure. That's why we don't place value judgments of, for example, the aged or the handicapped, ladies and gentlemen, because all the more you're disenfranchised, all the more we need to use state apparatus to lift you out of that disenfranchisement. That was the analysis that came up from our side. So even if we concede, ladies and gentlemen, that some tests aren't as good, we think there is still a moral imperative for states to do this anyway. But let's talk about the third issue, the effects, because this is where they said, look, parents will be absolved of their responsibilities. They're not going to play a big role in the education of their children. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, if they wanted to be involved anyway, they would do so to begin with. That's not the point. Their model or their incentive doesn't change either paradigm. But the second thing we have is this, that what happens if we tell the parents who aren't from communities who value education anyway, that their schools are bad, that the schools don't deserve funding? It's when you force them to acknowledge an unrealistic reality that the state has given up on your own children, and that the state has absorbed its responsibility of even helping your kids. That's why the uninvolvement process that they talked about will further reinforced under their paradigm, where even the parents feel that the state has forsaken the very people they want to protect. What then is the result on the children, ladies and gentlemen, or the students? Because there are only two results. Firstly, we need to understand that where would the intellectually perhaps slower kids go? They either go to nowhere, because the schools they go to are already shut down, which means they don't get an education at all, which is comparatively worse than their paradigm, or they go to the other schools who are perhaps smarter, whose perhaps structures are better, and are still a minority in those schools anyway because they were intellectually slower to begin with. That's why even the structures in those intellectually able schools won't be able to have specific education tailored towards them because they're mixing with people they can't compete with, not because the structures aren't adequate, but because they just can't. And that's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. You force them into a circle where they're unable to lift themselves because the structure isn't there, the social circumstance, the school in which they're in isn't there, and that's why they're all the more likely to fail. What do we tell you at the end of the day? This debate is a comparative one. We recognize that there are trade-offs, that perhaps some smarter ones don't get as much money to fund their talent, but we think it's necessary because there are others who will be far less off than their peers who will be far less off if they're able to reach their potential. That's the trade-off we oppose.
I'd like to thank Hui Chen for his speech, and I welcome the negative reply speaker, Neha.
Gentlemen, my question for this debate is, are the benefits that they talked about of improving the school system exclusive to linking standardized testing with funding? Because we don't think that those are benefits that come from that link. Often in their argumentation, those were benefits that came from using standardized testing or from publishing the results of those tests by creating information, but not necessarily the link to the fact that it's linked to funding. So that's going to be my first question. I'm going to talk to you about how the costs, in fact, are exclusive to that link, and that was the case we gave you from the opposition. So let's answer this first question, whether or not these benefits are exclusive to that link. So the first benefit we hear is that it motivates people to teach math and science, and we think that that's great because apparently only standardized tests are the reason why you teach math and science in a school. We think that just like philosophically, it doesn't make sense that the test is the only reason you teach anything in school. But more than that, we never contested the use of standardized tests. We're happy to have teachers mark examination. Like, they made us seem as if we're against examinations altogether. Like, we don't want to ever know how anybody's doing. No, ladies and gentlemen, we're absolutely happy to monitor progress. We're also absolutely happy to publish that progress, to create incentives for people who want to develop better reputations, to create incentives for teachers and parents to hold everybody accountable and all of that jazz. So again, we don't see why it has to come exclusively from linking it to funding. So we don't think that that's a benefit that falls on their side. We also think, ladies and gentlemen, the second idea, that they need these good test scores for to get jobs because they drop out of school anyway. Well, if they're dropping out of schools anyway, they're probably not doing very well on these tests. They're probably not going to get that job. They're not going to really have very good scores. But more than that, where is the magic in your policy that miraculously changes? Where is the threat of me having to shut down my school miraculously change that suddenly I'm going to start performing better? And this is where we told you that if after your 5-year lag, the 2 years of probation and 3 years of we will help you, even after state grants, state support, state intervention, state supervision, after 3 years, if you still can't fix your school, we think that either it's a call for us to continue to try and continue to do something about it and address the deeper problem, or it simply is just because these kids aren't going to ever really be able to perform on these standardized tests, that there is that intrinsic ability that is lacking in some of these students. And we think that all you do is create a stigma on these students where teachers and schools kind of want to wash their hands off of the problem, because now the problem is the student who just simply can never perform even after I try again and again. So we think that exclusive benefit doesn't come from. The only benefit that they gave us was let's raise the stakes, like it's some sort of gamble, ladies and gentlemen. We think that first of all, stakes are already high, but we also told you that we're happy to raise the stakes positively. We're happy to say that if you do better, you will get better funding, you will get better programs. But we think that the opposite, that the idea that you will be denied funding, that we will raise the stakes to the point that if you don't perform, you can't even have a school, creates a choice that doesn't even exist. Like the school has to basically fight for survival. We think that that's not the appropriate model for public schooling. That isn't about elitism. It's about egalitarianism and recognizing that we must continue to not want to give up on these kids. So what are the costs that are exclusive to them? Because their entire policy of introducing this huge amount of pressure is very, very costly. We don't think that they hid behind this notion of a structure, we need to blame the structure. We're not sure what that structure is, since they say that the teachers aren't really at fault, the parents aren't really at fault. So exactly who do you blame, ladies and gentlemen? We tell you the blame ends up being on the kid that can't perform on that test, because everybody else in that structure, the principal will move on and get another job. The teacher, if she still has any morale left, will move on and get another job. But it's the kid that gets shuttled from school to school, gets placed in schools where the average is high enough that they can take these stupid kids, and it's that kid that system then fails, ladies and gentlemen. So that's the player they never dealt with, so we don't think any of their benefits really stand.
I thank Neha for the negative reply. Now welcome Elle for the affirmative reply.
Madam Speaker, in this debate, the negative team tried to tell you that it was the affirmative team that was giving up on students. But that was the very same negative team that wanted to tell you it was unfair for us to judge schools based on their inability to upgrade the innate ability of those students, which under their proposal saw those students failing those standardised tests. We were happy to blame schools that were failing their students year after year on a comparative level, because that was the school's fault, Madam Speaker, because comparatively similar students were doing better in comparatively similar schools. The first question I'm going to ask is, which proposal achieves better educational standards? What we heard from the negative team is that high quality education was a right. That argument required them to prove that their form of education was better. So let's look at whether they proved that. We told you that under our proposal we could incentivise better education through grants and more active state supervision. The negative team agreed with that. Then we told you we could incentivise better educational standards through red listing schools. The negative team agreed with that. All of those concessions to our case, Madam Speaker, were strange, given their substantive spoke to the idea that they didn't want to discriminate on the basis of funding. But given that the NEG did make those concessions, what was the clash of this debate? This requires us to look at the difference between their incentives and our incentives that were backed up with implications and with punishments. There were two main differences. The first is that we told you that the negative team's reward-based incentives that rewarded schools for performing didn't actually condemn the schools that were failing. The product of that was that they didn't incentivise change in schools that were failing because they were getting money whether or not they were failing or whether they were succeeding. But the second problem was that you weren't even recognising truly the schools that were succeeding and the schools that were failing, because those bonuses didn't mean anything under the negative team's case, because they were received by both the schools at the end of the spectrum and the high part of the spectrum. But moreover, Bronwyn told you that those bonuses and that untargeted form of funding was more expensive than the targeted form that we spoke to you about. So the negative team thought in this debate that teachers and schools would respond to rewards that they gave again and again, rendering them meaningless. Our reward in this debate for incentivising innovation in schools was real, and it reflected the gravity of the failure in those schools year after year. Our reward, Madam Speaker, was letting those teachers keep their jobs because they had reformed their teaching practices. Then what we heard from the negative team was this was actually too harsh and that it would lead to a reduction in teacher morale. Firstly, given that they conceded to public shaming in a red list, that reduced the importance of this point within this debate. But moreover, we told you that teachers are employees, and if they're not performing, we should judge them on that basis. We also told you that their arguments about a more holistic education didn't actually acknowledge the fact that literacy and numeracy are the basis of all education, and that we needed to be constantly testing literacy and numeracy because it wasn't good enough for these students to simply rely on the SAT. So let's look at whether or not this meant that those students would leave these schools. We had 3 responses to this. The first was to say empirically it hasn't happened in jurisdictions that have adopted this. The second was to say that increased grants and energised state involvement meant that those students would want to stay in schools because those schools would be actively getting better. And thirdly, we told you that communities rallied around these schools through the advocacy that Bronwyn spoke to you about and the engagement that Bronwyn spoke to you about. But was it a problem if these students left these schools? We said no, because those schools were failing under the status quo. The first speaker told you that less capable students would move to good schools and wouldn't be able to compete there. We were happy if the product of our proposal was that students moved to better schools, Madam Speaker. We didn't want to keep funding schools that were failing those students. And because we proved that those schools were failing and they didn't deserve our funding, we won this debate.
I'd like to thank Elle for her reply and ask the audience to give both teams a round of applause.